Rishus, the Rosh Yeshiva, members of the Yankelewitz family, Talmidim of Rabbi Yankelewitz, Talmidei Yeshiva. We're gathered here tonight for an evening of Azkara, an evening to remember, to think about, to hear about the life of our revered senior Rosh Yeshiva, Gershon Yankelewitz, Zt'l. It's very important to show color the mace for this important leading to our figure and role model for the Bnei Yeshiva. The Akdama to the Ein Yaakov cites a medrash regarding machlokas as to what's the most central pasuk of the Torah that encapsulates all the messages. Ben Zoma says the pasuk of Shema Yisrael. Ben Nada says the pasuk of Yehavta l'reacha kamocha. And Shimon and Pazi is quoted as saying, "Hakeves echad taseh b'boker, as hakeves hasheni taseh ben harbai." So it's clear that the first two ideas, the first two psukim from Ben Zoma and Ben Nadas, Shema Yisrael, Yehavta l'reacha kamocha, those are central. If you ask any child, you say, does it make sense that maybe this encapsulates everything? They maybe say yes, maybe be on a list that you would ask a child. But what's Pshat in Shimon and Pazi? So the Bible Musar explained that Shimon and Pazi as a keves echad taseh b'boker, as a keves hasheni taseh ben harbayim, relate the message of consistency, of the day in, the routine, the day in and the day out. The carbon tummy was brought in the morning and brought in the afternoon. There were no breaks, and it's the idea of the true growth, the growth that's going to stay with the person. It's not just a flash of lights once in a while. They feel an inspiration and they do something. But it's the keves echad taseh b'boker, it's the keves hasheni taseh ben harbayim. Staying with the daily schedule, with one sets out goals, and to meet those goals, and to continuously work at them and plot and weigh, and again and again and again. I think this idea in some ways may represent what Rabbi Yankelewitz was for our yeshiva, the idea of consistency, the idea of day in and day out, coming to yeshiva, giving shiurim to the Talmidim of the yeshiva, keeping to the schedule. Nothing could stop him traveling into yeshiva every day for decade after decade after decade after decade after decade. And it's very important for the Talmidei Yeshiva who were able to see him, to see this consistency, to see this avodas Hashem of plodding away again and again, always being consistent in what he had to do. To this extent, one of the Talmidim from last year even mentioned that it could be that last year the Talmud missed more shiurim than Rabbi Yankelewitz over the course of the year because maybe the Talmud was out when he was sick. Even though the Talmud was more than 80 years younger, one would think much healthier. Yankelewitz came in day after day to yeshiva to give the shiurim, to be in the yeshiva. And we will dearly miss Yankelewitz as a role model for his mitos, his avodas Hashem, as a Baal Musar. It was mentioned in yeshiva already at the beginning of his man. And it's important that even though many Talmidim were not here yet during the time of the Levaya, it's important that the Talmidei Yeshiva and the Klal are here as well, that the Musar Seder that we add for Chodesh Elul between 10 and 10:15 when we daven Marav during Elul is the Lili Nishmasa, which should be a zechus for him, to be a zechus for the Yeshiva, that these 15 minutes extra of Musar that we dedicate in honor of Yankelewitz, and it should be a zechus for everyone here as well. I'd like to call upon Rosh Yeshiva, Rosh Kola, Rosh Shechter, to speak as well.
The Gemara has a discussion regarding the nature of Hesped. The Gemara comes to the conclusion that Hesped is considered covered on the ace. And if the ace is not on his covered, so you don't deliver Hesped. So in Shekhanat they quote that when the Yeshua passed away, he left instructions that they shouldn't deliver any Hesped, so they'd like to follow the instructions. So the Rebbe Yehuda said that it's not correct. That the only time we say that a hesped is only covered on mace, that's if it's a pashut person. But if it's a big Talmid Chacham, then it's certainly covered achayim. We brag about the fact that we knew this person, that learned in the same yeshiva with him where he was Talmidim and so on. This is certainly a Chofetz Chaim. Forget about the Chofetz Chaim, certainly Chofetz Chaim that delivering his statement for this unusual Talmid Chacham. Torah tells us in Parshas Kisava, Halach to the Drocha, it's supposed to preserve the zt'l of the king that all of us have already. We have to imitate the ways of our Baruch because we were created the zt'l, and the next pasuk continues. All Kalami Haaretz, all Rumusayim Vasik Yishem Hashem Nikol Lecha, that you have succeeded in retaining your zt'l of the king, you observe your zt'l of the king. The Yorub and Mechel, they will learn from you how to act with your Hashem. The part of the halach of the drocha, Gemara says, "Mahuchan, Mahurachu, Mahuperemesim, Mahuperemesim," and so on. Part of the halach of the drocha is to be a tzanua. Rabbi Yeshua describes HaKadosh Baruch Hu as a kel mistater. He hides all the time. He does such a good job at hiding that somebody who don't even believe that he's there. That there is anybody. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu is a tremendous tzanua. And part of halach b'droch requires that we should act in the fashion of tznius. Our Rebbe was a very, very private person. He would always play down his accomplishments, his acquaintances, whom he knew in Europe, whom he learned by, and so on. He would always knock everything down. He was extremely tzanua. He was tzanua in his Shanghai as well. Lubcza Bali Musar used to have an expression that they used to consider Frumkeit Achisar. Frumkeit means outward demonstration of one's piety. So they used to say the expression, a galach has to be frum, a yid has to be erlich. A galach has to advertise how pious he is. A yid has to be erlich. We never saw Rabbi Yankelewitz walking with tzitzis down to his knees. Never saw him bragging about his chumras, whatever. There's a fascinating book by an American Chacham, passed away a few years ago. He wrote a book that he as a teenager, his parents sent him to learn the tells for 8 years. He said there was an error in the tells he doesn't know. The 8 years whether the Rosh Yeshiva carried in the error, they didn't carry it. They never spoke about it. It was nobody's business whether they did carry it or didn't carry it. This rabbi who wrote this book is complaining that when he lives, there's an error that was made by prominent Talmidei Chachamim, and other people brag about the fact we don't carry the error. They advertise that. That's not. That wasn't the Lubcza start. They considered Frumkeit Achisar. The Gemara Bavitzi learns that from the pasuk, "Haydat Alehem es haderech sheyelchu bo v'samas asher ya'asu." The Gemara learns that from the pasuk that one has to go l'fnei Yeshua Sadim. So in Chashemishpot, the Ramah quotes the Machlokes Rishonim with Yekaifa on l'fnei Yeshua Sadim. Yekaifa on all the mitzvahs. So why should you be Yekaifa on l'fnei Yeshua Sadim? So I have a pasuk is supposed to go l'fnei Yeshua Sadim. So the Rishonim counted as one of the Torah mitzvahs to go l'fnei Yeshua Sadim. Remember, I heard from Talmud many years ago, to fulfill the Yeshua Sadin has to be the Nedivus Halei. If you're going to be kind for the person, and he doesn't want to do the Yeshua Sadin, so he's not going to be Yotzimnis. It doesn't come from the Nedivus Halei. It is Chasidus, and these kind of things that has to come, the person has to feel that he's up to that. They say the name of Rabbi Yankelewitz, I never heard of him, but they say his name. When he was a Talmud in the Yeshiva learning, so they were learning Mishnah Berurah, and said, "On that the Shachar Alatzma," said, "It goes, that goes on that one, it goes on this one." And today, every bacher in Yeshiva said, "On that Shachar Alatzma," means me. I'm the one that a person learns long enough to become a big Chacham, then he is a Baal Nefesh. Once he becomes a big Chacham, he should be Machmar Alatzma. But every time Dick and Harry should think that he's the Baal Nefesh, and everyone should be Machmar at everything. That's not the way it's supposed to be. So our Rebbe was quite a tzanua. Whatever chumras he observed, he wouldn't advertise. It was a whole group, and then one of the leaders from learned in Europe, and the Mir Yeshiva told me that they used to refer to those who were in the Bayis Rishon and those who were in the Bayis Shem. Those who were under the influence of the first Mashgiach, Rabbi Yankelewitz, and those who were under after the Rebbe passed away, and Azkara became the Mashgiach. So those who were under the influence of Rabbi Yankelewitz all had a certain style of speaking, mannerisms, and standing, a whole style of Havayas. I remember when my mother-in-law passed away. So I met Rabbi Yankelewitz. So he asks me, how's your shtiga doing? He says, she just passed away. So he said, you didn't hear? Where they said, Shiddu's going to come to me, Menachem. So he came. So my brother-in-law was sitting on one room, and all the sisters were sitting on the other. So he lived in Flatbush. So everybody came, all the men came to me, Menachem, my brother-in-law. And no one walked in, no one talked to me. So no one walked in to me, Menachem, by the way. So Yurikansky came. He said, is it all men? He came. It was Menachem, my brother-in-law. Then he goes into the other room. He's not embarrassed to speak to them. And the way he was standing by the door and speaking to them, my wife could have sworn that it was such often. They all had a certain style. Probably, if you picked up from Chofetz Chaim, I don't know, but we had the impression that it was the hashpah of the Mashgiach. So had such an influence on all the Talmidim. They had a big influence on the Rosh Yeshiva, the Radin Yeshiva, gave the shiur. Mashgiach had tremendous influence. Very soft-spoken, style of composure. I was a Talmud of Rabbi Yankelewitz before my bar mitzvah, Yeshiva Tana. My family lived in Philadelphia. My parents sent me to New York to stay by my grandparents. And I learned in Radin Yeshiva. So now we have a phenomenon that people sit and learn in the kollel. They know how to learn very well. And it's beneath their dignity to take anything lower than a semikhah shiur, or college shiur. High school shiur, that's beneath their dignity. Elementary school, that's what you have to take. Remember, many years ago, group of European Rosh Yeshiva signed a called encouraging, remember, I think Lubcza signed it, many prominent Rabbanim signed a called encouraging the people who learn in Kodelim to please take positions to teach in elementary school that shouldn't consider to meet their dignity. The people Radin was such a person he writes that he was a Ramadan, he taught little children. And it starts off at the beginning of the Igeris, about how do you translate, when you teach Tanakh to the children, how do you translate this word, how do you translate the Aleph, Beis, how do you translate Afarsimon, how do you translate Botman, how do you translate Yidid, elementary things. He taught Chumash and he taught Tanakh. I remember I learned Chumash and Rashi for Rabbi Yankelewitz. You learned Haskala's Gemara, you learned Gemara and Rashi, you learned Gemara about the Kama. Gemara says the person should have the attitude, short and built of the Shukah. You should take even at the meaning position, make up an us. You shouldn't say Gavar Rabba no. You shouldn't say it's beneath my dignity. It wasn't beneath Yankelewitz's dignity. The Gemara Shavuos on that, in Chesed Beis, comments on the Pasuk. Havod HaKadosh V'Echol, Horace B'nei Yisrael, and then it says, Ishik Kisas Really Yoda Zohar. The Gemara has a member from Gershon called Amavdal of Ayayim, Matzoy Shabbos, says, Havyan Labonim Rukuyim Lohayro, based on this passage. Havod HaKadosh V'Echol, Horace B'nei Yisrael, Ishik Kisas Really Yoda Zohar. Someone told me over at Russia from Amsal on that Gemara, what's the connection between making Havdalah and having Banim Rukuyim Lohayro? He said up there, Chadush, that many have the meaning when you recite Havdalah, you fill up the cup, not just Mole Al-Kol does until it flows over, overflows. So he says, a Rebbe who's teaching Talmidim, he's only going to be 10 lessons ahead of the Talmidim, so he's not going to be a good teacher. The Rebbe has to be light years ahead of the Talmidim. The Rebbe has to be like Havdalah. You fill up the cup and it overflows. And the Rebbe is telling Talmidim the overflowing part. The whole cup is all full that he doesn't tell the Talmidim. It's the fallout that you have. You drop a bomb, So the palm drops over here, and then you have fallout the vicinity. The Rebbe's teaching Tavim has to be light years ahead of the Talmud. I was learning Chumash and Rashi in elementary school, and the Rebbe knew all the Rashis from the Gemara. He didn't have to figure it out now. He knew all the Gemaras. I remember my children learned in elementary school. Studied with them for an exam. And then one of the children had a mechina question, I said, what's the name of this? He didn't know what it's called. I started to tell, oh yeah, he knows that. He just didn't know that it's called the name of this. A Rebbe has to know what the Lashon is. You have in a siddur, it says, every bracha in the Shemanes, it says, oh, it's Buras, Kedushas Hashem, Bina, every bracha, smikhah. Every bracha has a name. The baby has to have a name. When you teach Chumash, you have to teach with the terminology of the Torah Shabbat Tech. I was in elementary school right after the war, so my Rebbe were all refugees who came from Europe, learned in Yeshiva all their lives. You should all, those who prepare themselves to go to Chinuch should realize you have to be years ahead of the Talmud. You're just going to be 5-10 lessons ahead of the Talmud, and it's just not going to do it. Rabbi Yankelewitz was such a Rebbe. He was light years ahead of all of the Talmud, and that's why he was successful in teaching. He taught us Babakam, quite a few times. We learned Babakam with Rashi, we learned Chumash. I remember some of the things of Chumash. Easy Chumash.
There's a shiur in front of that.
Shus Rav Sester, Chalach, Rosh Yeshiva, Nalecha Yeshiva, members of the Mishpacha, Talmidei Yeshiva. I was never formally a Talmud of Yankelewitz at the Bracha, but I did have the merit to have a shtickle shaykhs, small shaykhs with him. Yankelewitz, who learned in Radin, knew my maternal grandfather, who also learned under the Chofetz Chaim. Over the years, I've tried many times to expose Talmidim to the hidden treasure that we had in Yeshiva whenever possible. A few years ago, Yankelewitz, zt'l, graced my shiur's Chanukah Mesiba, and shiur beautiful Divrei Torah. More recently, I arranged for several Talmidim to learn with Yankelewitz the Sefer Das Torah of Lubcza, Mir Yeshiva. And then about 2 years ago, I started meeting myself with Rabbi Yankelewitz each week on Thursday for about 30 to 45 minutes, and we would learn Sefer Das Torah of Lubcza. But none of this qualifies me to capture the essence of our Rebbe. B'tchilu u'rechimu, I offer these words in the spirit of Divrei Haracha, so that the Talmidei Yeshiva can gain a bit of an appreciation of the great treasure that we had in our midst. Chazal tell us, Yitzias Tzadik min hamakom oserosha. Tzadik's departure leaves an impression. The impression is described in terms of 3 aspects: Hod, Ziv, and Hada. When a tzaddik is present, Hu Hoda, Hu Ziva, Hu Hadar. When a tzaddik leaves, Pana Hoda, Pana Ziva, Pana Hadar. The Maral of Gurariye and the Rashi in RIETS explains that the 3 expressions, Hoda, Ziva, and Hadara, correspond to 3 different realms of a tzaddik's influence. There's Yiras Shamayim, there's Chachma, and there's Midos Tovos. Hod, which comes from the word praise or thanks, refers to the quality of Yiras Shamayim, which by its very nature is worthy of praise and accolades, as the pasuk says, Isha Yiras Hashem Hi Tishalo. Ziv, which means splendor, represents Chachma. as the pasuk says, Chachmas Adam Toya Panav. Hadar, which connotes beauty, Shanghai, is a reference to Midos Tovos, just as the Mishnah Rabbi Yankelewitz describes Tif'eres Yoseha, a beauty for one who displays them. For almost 60 years, our yeshiva was zocheh to have each tzaddik in our midst to exemplify each of these aspects the fullest. The Yer Shamayim of Rabbi Yankelewitz was palpable. His meticulousness in Shmiras HaMitzvos, Kala Kebachamura, as was mentioned already by others, he would stand for Kriyas HaTorah well past his 100th birthday. He would make sure to wash Netilas Yadayim for Tefillah, not rely on having done so in the morning. And as recently as this past Tisha B'Av, he insisted on sitting on the ground like everyone else. And when his son, Moshe Zangizun, who I have a kesher with, objected, he said, "This is how I always did it." His Torah, Rabbi Yankelewitz left notebooks and notebooks filled with Chidushei Torah, including shiurim that he heard from the Brisker Rav. We never heard about it. He gave it over. His asmada was remarkable. He could sit literally for hours at the age that he was, over a Gemara. And his chavrusos would go for coffee breaks and he would continue learning. And all the Torah that he taught the main Talmidim over the years. And finally, the Midos Tovos, extraordinary Midos Tovos. Rabbi Yankelewitz was a gentleman in every sense of the word. He was always quick to offer compliments and express his genuine sense of appreciation. There was a reception a few months ago at the home of President Joel. Rabbi Yankelewitz was there, and at one point he turned to Mrs. Bronstein, the wife of Rabbi Chaim Bronstein, the administrator at RIETS. He said, "So much of the yeshiva rests on the shoulders of your husband. You have the presence to make the comment." And he could never be heard saying a word of Lashon Hara or speaking badly about anybody. The Wayu Musmach, who recently retired from the rabbinate, he lives with me in Passaic, he shared with me, I knew he learned by Rabbi Yankelewitz, so he said, I had him as a Rebbe 50 years ago in MTA, and what I recall the most was that Rabbi Yankelewitz never raised his voice in class. But it's more than that. As again, son of Moshe said to me, he never raised his voice at all. His passing leaves an indelible void within yeshiva. Pana Hoda, Pana Ziva, Pana Hazar. For Rabbi Yankelewitz, these three components were not discrete aspects of his personality. They were part of an organic whole, and they were inseparable from one another. The Hadar, the extraordinary Menschlichkeit in Derech Eretz, was not separate from his Torah and Yiras Shamayim. His Torah, his Yiras Shamayim, and his Midos Tovos were Chativa Achas, an integrated entity. Rabbi Yankelewitz was an integrated personality. He embodied a sense of shleimus. Like a polished diamond, there were no rough edges. It's impossible to truly appreciate the greatness of a Rebbe without understanding the world that shaped him. Rabbi Yankelewitz was molded by the great yeshivas in Lubcza, primarily Radin and Mir, and he was deeply impacted by the Musar movement, whose ideals permeated the Chofetz Chaim Yeshiva. Musar and the work of Tikkun HaMidos wasn't divorced from Talmud Torah, it was part and parcel of the same enterprise. Just as amelus, sweat and toil, was extended in analyzing sugya after sugya in Shas, so did amelus go into dissecting the sugya of Shmiras HaMidos, exercising self-discipline in refining one's personality and character. Musar taught that there should be no bifurcation within one's personality, no difference between ben adam hamakom, ben adam hachavero, between how one behaves in public among people and how one behaves behind closed doors. Rabbi Yankelewitz was a product of the world of Musar. While in Radin, he was privileged to be Meshamish the Chofetz Chaim, the end of the life of the Chofetz Chaim, and later on he became attached to the Mir Mashgiach of Yerucham, whose svarim literally lo pasku li'al shulchanan. They wouldn't leave his table. Even more than Radin, it was the experience of Mir that left a lifelong impact on Rabbi Yankelewitz and his personality. Of all the great yeshivas in Europe, only the Mir Yeshiva managed to miraculously survive the ravages of the war, largely intact, escaping first to Kobe, Japan, and then to Shanghai before being transplanted in America, Brooklyn, and in Eretz Yisrael. The miraculous nature of that story is well documented. The years in Shanghai were incredibly defining and enormously productive. The phenomenal growth in Torah and Musar that was experienced in that protected enclave, that haven, was surreal. And the bonds that were forged among those who were there were everlasting. The Talmidim of Mir, who lived through this kufa, are known as the Alta Mir. There's a famous picture of them learning in the Beis Medrash of Shanghai with almost all the names accounted for. Rabbi Yankelewitz was already then in his 30s at the outbreak of the war, was looked upon as being from the Alta Bachrim. After all, he had been in the Mir and heard shibudins from Yerucham, who had been nifter in the early 30s, 1934. In my youth, I was zochet to learn in Mir Yeshiva in Brooklyn, where many of my rabbeim were Alta Mir. And over the years, I've encountered a fierce shiur of Alta Mir in various places. But even as Alta Mir go, there was something about Rabbi Yankelewitz that stood out. And it's not just my own observation. I have a neighbor in the Lower East Side that I still visit, and he brought Talmidim to visit with him. He was from a little younger generation, but Moshe Pivovitz, who loved Chaim Tovim. And I spoke to him earlier today, and I asked him for some recollections of Rabbi Yankelewitz. And he told me that for the 5 years in Shanghai, he sat right next to him during davening. And he said to me, he recalled a conversation he had with Rav Shimon Ram, who was the Rosh Yeshiva here, and Rabbi Yankelewitz, Gershon Yankelewitz's name came up. And Rabbi Pivovitz told me that he told Rav Shimon Ram, if you want to know what a real mirror was, look at Rav Gershon Yankelewitz. He's always calm. He never is angry, never got excited. His language, he epitomized the mir. For Rabbi Yankelewitz, Musa wasn't just an intellectual exercise. It was a way of life. Rabbi Yerucham's shmuzin weren't just vertlach, to say over. They were values of life that he personified and he internalized. Those who are familiar with Rabbi Yerucham's shmuzin know that the notion of shleimus, the integrated personality, is a recurring and favorite theme of Rabbi Yerucham. That Yankelewitz zt'l embodied that sense of shleimus because he was a living Musa Sefer. How did this sense of shleimus manifest itself here on these shores in our yeshiva? Rabbi Yankelewitz lived his life with a cheshbon. Everything he did was carefully thought out. In Yiddish, the word would be ausgecheshbon. He had an impeccable sense of yashrus and a deep achrayus to his avodas hakodesh, as you heard already. Almost until his 100th birthday, he traveled to yeshiva each day from his home in the Bronx by 2 buses, and he walked a few blocks from 181st Street. It was only several years ago that yeshiva arranged for him to travel to and from yeshiva with a car service. When his Rebbetzin was nifter several years ago, he decided against going to Eretz Yisrael for the Hakamas Ma'aseva, not because he wasn't up to the trip. He actually traveled subsequently to Eretz Yisrael for a family simcha, but because it would mean that he'd have to miss giving shiur for several days. During the summer break, Rabbi Yankelewitz would spend hours each day preparing the semikhah that the yeshiva was planning to learn the following zman. Just this past June, I received a call from Rabbi Gershon, who has been the personal shamus for Rabbi Yankelewitz since the passing of the Rebbetzin. He called to check with me which parak of Ksuvis the yeshiva was learning. So I said, we're learning the 3rd parak, Levunaris. So and I later heard Rabbi Yankelewitz had originally begun learning the 1st parak with one of his grandchildren, when he heard that Yeshiva was learning Elunaris, he immediately switched his Seder Limud to Elunaris. The car service generally picked him up from his home at about 9:30. He would arrive here somewhere between 9:45 and 10:15, depending on traffic. And the car would park just outside the parking lot across the street. Sometimes I would arrive at around the same time, and I'd be lucky enough to escort Rabbi Yankelewitz from the car to his office in First Hall, room 508. Often a Goldwicht, sometimes another Rebbe would be there to help him walk to his office, and on many occasions, the schus went to his devoted driver, Virgilio. Even at the age of 104, Rabbi Yankelewitz did not use a cane or a walker. Rather, he held on to the elbow of whoever was helping him, and he made the trek from the parking lot, down the block, up the stairs, into the building, to the elevator, and up to his office. Rabbi Yankelewitz would spend several hours each day in his office learning, and various Talmidim would stream in at different times to learn from him, to hear shiur from him. I would typically visit Rabbi Yankelewitz in his office on Thursdays. We would learn, say, for Das Torah for about 30 minutes, 45 minutes. There was something surreal and extraordinary about learning with a gadol of this caliber. Someone who still had his wits about him at the age of 103, 104. He'd read each word aloud with his heavy accent, including the Mar Makom that appeared within the parentheses. And after concluding a paragraph or two, he would look up and he'd say, so what is he saying? And he would prompt me to summarize the main points of this paragraph into one sentence or two sentences. And then I started to look forward to this time together every week. It became a highlight of my week. And so much so that after his man ended in mid-June, I came to his house and we learned together in his home. At the semikhah this past March, as the Rosh Yeshiva marched onto the stage, everyone was told to find the shiur with his name on it. For some strange reason, I could not find the shiur with the name Adler. One of the administrators, Mr. Jeffrey Rosengarten, noticed the problem and immediately stood up from his seat. He motioned for me to sit down where he was. As a shkacha practice would have it, this seat was to the immediate right of Rabbi Yankelewitz. The semikhah lasted for several hours, and Rabbi Yankelewitz stayed throughout. At about 5 or 6 points along the way, there were musical interludes, and everyone in the auditorium stood up. To my surprise, each and every time, Rabbi Yankelewitz turned toward me, and he turned to Rabbi Twersky, who was on his left, and he motioned to us to help him up. Despite his age and his health, he did not want to deviate from minhag hamakom. As Chazal say, Al Tihi Yoshev Bein Ha'omdim. But that's not all. At the conclusion of the semikhah, each of the 200 plus musmachim came up to the stage to be acknowledged and to shake hands with the various Rosh Yeshiva. This part of the proceeding must have taken a good half hour. For the entire duration, Rabbi Yankelewitz stood there, supported by myself and Rabbi Twersky, and as each new musmach passed in front of him, Rabbi Yankelewitz extended his hand and wished hatzlacha. That's the essence of a Musaf personality. Of all the remarkable qualities, I think the one that stands out the most was the anava. Rabbi Yankelewitz didn't simply preach anava, he lived it, he breathed it. He carried himself with an incredible pashtus, and that was his godless. He was tocho kibaro, with no ears about him. What for most of us would be a pchisas hakavod meant nothing to him. Not because he didn't have a sense of dignity. To the contrary, he had a certain legal, aristocratic quality to him. It's just that the kinds of things that are petty things that get most of us annoyed were simply not important. He could make efforts to attend a simcha without the slightest thought about getting a kibbutz, because receiving kavod was not on his radar screen. His attitude toward life was very positive. He had a wonderful sense of humor and not an ounce of cynicism. He treated everyone, young and old, with respect. He would freely compliment the Talmidei Yeshiva, saying things like, "You are tops." He had tremendous Azkara Satov to the yeshiva for providing him with the opportunity to learn and to teach. Again, Rav Moshe's son shared with me the following. Each year, the last day of his month, he would come in to gather his belongings from his office. It was firm that had to be returned to the library, and he would comment about how wonderful it was that the library would allow a person, faculty, to take out a sefer for 6 months. Chidush to him. He appreciated it. And then there was farm that had to go back to the Beis Medrash. And then he made an account of everything he needed to take with him. He would take leave of his office. He'd kiss the mezuzah, and he'd express a tefillah to the Rebbeinu Shalom that he should have the schus and the koyach to return after the summer and to continue giving shiur for another year. The Gemara in Sanhedrin, Peches on the base, Sholchu mitam ezel ben olam haba, Anderson, Shvalberach, Shayif Ayel, Shayif Nofik, Goris Beiraisa Tedira, Ulmachzik, Tibusa Lenafshe. Fusa ben olam haba, someone who's modest and humble, enters bowing, leaves bowing, Goris Beiraisa Tedira, learns Torah all the time and does not take credit for oneself. The ultimate tribute, Ulmachzik, Tibusa Lenafshe, that epitomized of Yankelewitz. The sense of anova, not to hold himself as special. People would ask for brachas all the time. He felt uncomfortable. I was there this past following Pesach. I brought my children to visit in the house of his son Yankel in Muncie. So it was like with the coaxing of his daughter-in-law, we were able to get a bracha. Nichma Yoel said, he wants to ask his father, Papa, why are you so reluctant to give brachas? And Rabbi Yankelewitz responded the most amazing thing. I'm afraid if I start doing that, I'll become a Baal Gaiva. That comment says it all. The pasuk in Mishnah says, "V'lanovim yitain chen." Rabbi Yankelewitz was blessed with an incredible sense of chen. If you knew him, you loved him. If you were in his presence, you felt embraced by his positive energy. Chazal tell us there's a list of things which the main reward is in Olam Haba, but it bears dividends in Olam Hazeh. Ehud Varm Shad Mochel Perseim Olam Hazeh, Hakem Keyom Olam Haba. Rabbi Yankelewitz was zeichet to his Meisim Tovim to reap payers in Olam Hazeh. He was zeichet to the gift of Arichas Yomim, with all of his lips about him until the end. He, along with his Rebbetzin Buma Alei Shalom, raised a family of 7 children, Banim, Ubnei Banim, Oskim, the Torah of Milas Chasadim. I recall the Rebbetzin once mentioning to me on one occasion how proud she was of the fact that every one of her children are involved in Torah and Milas Chasadim. He was able to participate in many family simchas, even traveling to Eretz Yisrael a few short years ago, past his 100th birthday. This is not sheer coincidence. It's not a function of good DNA. It's a gift from HaKadosh Baruch Hu l'mala min hateva. We at Yeshiva of Yitzchak Elchanan were zeich for all these many years to have a giant in our midst. Someone who offered a window into the Torah world of the past. Someone who bore the imprint of the Mesorah in every fiber of his being. Someone who was a walking Musa Sefer, whose Torah, Yerushalayim, and Ma'aseh Tovim were all fashioned from the same cloth, were part of one Chativa Achas, one integrated personality, one integrated Musa personality. Someone who personified the Midah of Anova, whose godless was contained within his pashtus. We, the Talmidim, have an achrayus to reflect on what he stood for, to strive to live our own lives with that sense of shleimus, with the genuine Anova that epitomized his life. Chazal say, "Gdol tzadikim b'misasa, those who live l'chayein." Tzadikim have enormous hashpaya on the world even after the soul leaves their bodies. May Rabbi Yankelewitz be a Melos Yosher for his family, for his Talmidim, for our Yeshiva, for all Kal Yisrael. We will miss him deeply. Chaval al da'adin, v'lo nishtachtin, Yhi Zichro Baruch.
Real young girl.
Yeshivas, Talmidim, I follow up so much. I'm preceded by two Yeshivas who both part of my life, some more less, but Schechter, Yeshiva, grew up with that name always, and he definitely so succinctly defined my father from his perspective, very admirable, so eloquently, and I'm always left with most of my speech missing. So forgive me for some duplication. There were numerous articles that I saw in the last 2 weeks that tried to find, and quite eloquently, to portray who my father Shalom was. The universal feeling that they gave over and that we heard at Lubcza summed him up to be a person who personified a living Torah and an educator par excellence. He was all that, but what I can add to what the Yeshivas spoke about is from the perspective of the son growing up in the home. I can still picture my earliest memories of living in a one-bedroom apartment, and there were ultimately 5 children there. My father waking up early before he went off to Radin Yeshiva. Saying and the Ani, brothers, then leaving the little paper bag, brown paper bag, that was food, lunch for the day. After teaching us a language, he'd go off to the Mendel's Azkara on the west side, and came back after we were sleeping. That was a regular day. Then came Shabbos, Yom Menucha. But from the first day, even in that little apartment, there was never a Friday night that there weren't Talmidim who came consistently. I left home when I was almost 14 to go off to Yeshiva. I spent 13 years away from home. But all those years till I left, every single Friday night, there were Bachrim who came, whether they're shining, blizzard or not, to their credit too. But there was never a Friday night, and I realized now when I was sitting Shiva, there was never a Friday night that my father went to sleep early, because I was always coming. I can remember their names. From Kuddish, from Piadesnik, Nate Norgel, A.B. Reader, A.B. Ryder. These were what we grew up with. And you think after that, Shabbos morning, maybe sleep late, we never woke up and he wasn't up before us learning. And davening, of course, you have to be on time. Time means early on time. That was the memories of as a young child. He was a son who lost his parents in 1941 with who perpetuated their memory with a yard site where he sat and learned 6.5 to 8 hours without looking up from the sefer a year ago. Sat without looking up from the sefer, without getting up from his seat for that longer period. I personally, one correction to Rabbi Yankelewitz, it was I who learned with him this summer for the first time in 45 years. And started off with Subas at the beginning, and then I went Iris. When I got him in largely Erie, which was easier to learn at, forget it. I was gone. I lost him in the Erie. I got up, walked away, came back. He's still going. That was the father. That was the son. He was a husband who helped him home. You can all picture him drying the dishes, standing with an apron. And who, I still remember coming back from camp to the old Camp Field in the Lower East Side, and he stopped into a store and white chocolate had just come out. And he was so excited to bring home something for his wife, a new treat with white chocolate. I still remember that very well. He was a father who was there always for us. He was available for us. He was here. We talked about the phenomenal Talmid Chacham who personified learning, with phenomenal Hasmada. But at the same time, he was a father. He was a grandfather. He was a great grandfather, and he relished those jobs. I took a collage of pictures from the kitchen table hanging up on my refrigerator now. Every single picture, you see my father holding a different grandchild. Keep in mind that his first grandchild was born when he was 67, and the others was 92. When I came back from Yeshiva, from being out of town, I was already married with children. I moved back to New York and had the opportunity to learn other aspects of his that I never knew as a child, besides the Talmidim who came Friday nights and Shabbos afternoons, and the Talmud that he went up to Fordham Road to learn what to keep him connected. And he also, how he made himself available for his Talmidim to learn with them in his office years ago already. Any Talmud wanted to come in and learn with him. We talked about his phenomenal concentration. Later years, recent years, after my mother Gershon was nifter, so the first year we started going to him for Shabbos, but subsequent to that he came to us for Shabbos. Friday night, after a meal, you learn for a while, but most people go to sleep after a while. So especially for an hour, whatever, and then you go to sleep Friday night, right? No, he was sitting and learning, and I couldn't go to sleep before he go to sleep. One time my youngest daughter, shiur, relieved me, and I went to sleep and she stayed up. But she said he outlasted her too. I mentioned that we were preparing Ksubas this year with the Erie, but 3 years ago I believe we should have learned Yevamos, summer. And I was there the day that he started preparing Yevamos. That was his highlight, by the way. As soon as the office would let him know the semikhah, get the spark, get to work. And I came up there to visit him in the country. He's sitting and learning with a Chabrusa. Did an hour, he doesn't look up. I went back to the city, and I called him that night to say hello, told him I was there to visit him. Aga, on a light note, I asked him, no, so how was Yevamos number whatever time that you did it? And he said to me, just as hard as ever. During the summer, these past few years, when we went up to the country, he didn't give his Mishnah shiur, which he had given for 62 years. The Mechan year after year since 1952, he gave a shiur of Mishnahs, starting with Talmidim at the time, years ago, who were Talmidim, Beres Talmidim, and then he became a simple Yidden. He never came to a shiur without preparing. Even these later years, when he had done it so many times already, and with about people who, but as Rabbi Yankelewitz said, but you have to be, Rabbi Shefter said, you have to be steps ahead. You have to prepare for it, no matter who you say. But he was a normal person, a regular person too. He would run across Pelham Parkway. I mean, it's the Bronx. I don't know if anybody knows what the Bronx is, but Pelham Parkway is a parkway with beautiful park on both sides. We had a shortcut that we cut through to make it faster to shul. And he would run weekdays in the park and challenge us to try to catch him. Okay. He was already in his late 50s at the time. But that was a father. An old Talmud of Yeshiva here told me how years ago in MTA, the Bachim were in the gym. Chin-ups, whatever. My father walked by the room and saw them struggling. He went in, did some chin-ups with them. Connected to a Bachim. He also was never embarrassed to let them know that he played soccer as a child and how his shins were still black and blue all the years later from the soccer games that he played as a Bachim. Those who came from Achmolo, we passed through his two beauties, two 10-foot-high evergreen bushes, cylindrical. When he was 96, he was still standing on the ladder trimming it. When we walked home from shul on Shabbos, a trip that should have taken 7 minutes, 10 minutes, took 45 minutes. Every yid was accorded the cover that he deserved. Every person who had something to talk about was given a chance to talk. Every person who had a problem to discuss was given a chance to discuss. My brother Moshe told me a story about how a yid came to him with a problem with chalonos. father, as you heard, into brachas and things like that. I added took away my best line of the evening about not wanting to do brachas because we make them about gaiva. But it's persistence. They told him, you know what, the yid that puts out the mishnayos for mishnayos shiur is not going to be doing it anymore. He moves away, you take it over. That would be your school for not having dreams anymore. Kachab, no more dreams. Okay? What was it? It was just plain bullshit, you know? Gave him something to do, to focus on. And then everybody started coming for brachas. So my father said that somebody asked him this summer, how's it in the country? He said, I'm busy entertaining everybody. My daughter Penina told me how she's a young lady, shortly after 30. When we used to come for Shabbos with the children, so we go to sleep, Shabbos afternoon. My father took care of the grandchildren, took them to the park. We're talking about 25 years ago. Took care of the grandchildren to the park. My niece Malka graduated high school 2 years ago. Father was there at the graduation. My nephew Shmuel, the youngest grandchild, had a museum, Scholas Gemara, this past year. Baby was there. Not only was there, he spoke. Told him over about Chofetz Chaim. Spoke for 15 minutes in English. My shviga summed it all up. She said when she was here at the Levaya that she would have loved to stand up and speak. She wanted to say, as was mentioned, he was a Talmid Chacham, personified that, but he was a gentleman par excellence. He knew how to treat people. He knew how to make people feel good. It's not a shiur. Talmid Chacham, personified Torah. That, I don't know, it's not a shiur. It is one thing. It mentioned that he stood for, till recently, not recently. I visited him Thursday for shiur. Sunday too, but I was there Thursday. I was there by Mincha. I was not feeling perfect. I said, maybe sit down for a chazar shots. A few days before he was Mincha. You don't compromise. You want to know how you get to where he got? You don't compromise. No shortcuts. Most of you are young Talmidim. Most of you didn't really know him. But he believed in you. He was extremely proud. And he believed that you could aspire to the same things that they aspired to. And you could reach them. Bacher asked him, how did you get to be the way you were? He answered him and he said, what do you think? Mir was a summer camp? Summed up with one word. Adam v'amol duva. You could do it. We could all do it. Just remember, and it's not a shiur to enjoying life. Adam v'amol duva is not saying that you can never enjoy your life. That Adrab, you'll enjoy it much better. I'll tell you one secret in life. Dive into learning, grow in your learning, make it your life. When you get old, you'll have what to do. But remember that he believed in all of you. And you can get there. I shall be through
Here with the grandson out of the blood.
I just want to say I was going to talk about my grandpa's consistency, but it's hard to do that when you're standing in front of people who that consistency is not 20 years like by me, maybe it's 50 years, maybe it's 60 years. I just want to say something that Zadie would have wanted to have said by his Azkara. And that is that people always ask, what was the secret that he lived so long? And none of us really know the answer. which is why I think it's fitting that this Azkara is over here, because here in this yeshiva, I think is the real answer. If Zaidi got up in the morning thinking that he was going to yeshiva, it's because here in this yeshiva, they gave him that opportunity. If Zaidi pulled through a summer because he's preparing shiur, it's because he knew that when he came here for El, he knew that there would always be, as long as he was here to come, as long as he was alive, there'd always be a shiur for him. So I think this Azkara over here is not just Azkara of my grandfather, it's Azkara on 60 years of Kavod HaTorah and Shema Shacham. And because I think I was outdone by all the speakers before me, I'm not going to say anything. I just wanted to share with something Zaidi himself said by the Levaya of one of the yeshivas of YU, Rabbi Jones, a friend of Gershon, something I can't say. I just want to say it over because he would have said it about a different Talmud. Zaidi said, Rabbi Jones Levaya, he said that the Nifter held the hand of the B'chan held the hand of the Chofetz Chaim, and the Chofetz Chaim held the hand of the Gershon. By me, besides for the Zaidi that you all knew, I'm different than all other people who spoke. I happen to be a grandchild of Chofetz Chaim, but to me, it was more than just being a descendant of Chofetz Chaim. With Zaidi, I had a connection to Chofetz Chaim. It wasn't just a great-great-grandfather where I could trace my ancestry back. It was, to me, when I was in the dining room with my grandfather, the Chofetz Chaim was sitting right behind me, wherever Zaidi was looking. I one time told him that I was learning with my grandfather DSL over the phone, and the concept was so fascinating to him that he told me the shmuz of the Chofetz Chaim of the that in Moisim Shia things will be so advanced, because to him everything reminded him of the Chofetz Chaim. Zaidi, whenever you would ask the Chofetz Chaim, you'd always hear with a story, well-worn, famous story about the Chofetz Chaim's furniture. Because to him, I think that wasn't just another story, it was a way of life that no matter how long you hear, be it as long as my grandpa was, be it as long as his Rebbe, the Chofetz Chaim was, it's always temporary. Because temporary is not an amount of time, it's an idea. And Zaidi, I think, he lived his whole life with that idea. As the president, I remember saying, the dean of YU said, but Zaidi always felt that he wasn't really here. You felt that part of him was still in Radin, in a previous world, and part of him was heading to the next world. Zaidi was someone who his whole life embodied the words of the Zohar that says, this is the bottom world, the world that we're in, and semikhah, this is the next world. That's something that Zaidi lived, because that's who his Rebbe Chofetz Chaim was, and I think that with Zaidi we could say that he held the hand of the Chofetz Chaim his whole life, and the Chofetz Chaim held the Rebbe Shalom's hand.
We have words from the son-in-law and from
It's a big honor to be able to speak in front of this island, as it's been mentioned before. Family, from the depths of our heart, feel a tremendous Azkara Satov to the yeshiva. And in terms of thinking of the secret of his long life, you could say that the yeshiva was machayim, no doubt about it, and added years undoubtedly to his life. So we greatly appreciate what the yeshiva has done over the last, number of years, but especially at the end of his life. The Chofetz Chaim, in explaining one of the psukim in last week's parasha, says that it depends who you ask in terms of whether it's chachma, whether it's wealth, whether you're really getting a real estimation of wealth or wisdom. You go to a villager and you ask the villager, nope, who's a smart person? The villager will say to you, of a person who, when the letters come from far away and no one in the village knows how to read the letter, so he reads the letter, of course, that's from a villager. When you go to a big university, I suppose, and you want to know what chachma is there, and someone says, this guy's smart, boy, he's smart. You ask a villager who's wealthy, well, a guy who might have 2 rooms instead of 1 room in his house. You go to a city, they'll tell you, Rothschild. With this idea, Chofetz Chaim explains a pasuk in Parashat Shoftim. The Rabbi Yankelewitz calls someone a chacham. You know what that means when the Rabbi Yankelewitz calls someone a chacham? The Rabbi Yankelewitz, who encompasses all chachma, all wisdom, and he calls someone a chacham, that's a chacham. And if the Rabbi Yankelewitz says that Shaycha kimiyaber ene chachamim misalei tevei tzadikim, the Rabbi Yankelewitz knows what he's talking about. And it's because of that, we read in the Gemara, how when a great Talmid Chacham would be, in the slightest way, given a favor, the person disqualified themselves from judging a case. Well, Chaim Wasserman takes it a step further. He says this is not only regarding a judge, someone who's about to judge a case in court, but this is applicable to life in general. And he goes on to explain in Kovi's Mamarim, and you can go to the biggest university and with a real big chachamim, and you can have a chair in university where they discuss atheism and how that's a true way of life, and how a person who the Rambam called the step below Nevuah, Aristotle, could struggle understanding that there is a Rabbi Yeshiva. And he explains it simply by saying that people are motivated by whatever they need to do. It could be laziness, it could be taiva, it could be anything that can get a person rolling in a different and a wrong direction. The reason why I bring this up is because when I think about my father-in-law, and I think about the different characteristics that everybody's been speaking about, and how he's great in Anava, how he's great in Torah, how he's great in focus, to me, the greatest thing you could say about him, and he really, as they would say, hit his highest note in his last years of his life. People use the slightest excuses to not to do things. Person's laziness excuses away all sorts of lack of activity. People get older, they're self-absorbed. He really, really achieved, in my eyes, his greatest stature in life as his life was winding down. And everyone is talking about how, Baruch Hashem, he was blessed. But let me tell you something. The last 5 years of his life was no picnic. He struggled to get out of a chair. He needed assistance to walk across the room. He didn't have his wife. He lived with a caregiver. Now, everything it was as best as it could be, but as you get older, as great as there could be a situation in a yeshiva, but we know, and I'm not as old, nearly as old, as you get older, you're being cast to the side. You're no longer The young boys don't want to hear a shiur from an old man. And you're pushed to the side. You don't count anymore. You're made to feel that you're a nobody. And you're struggling with loneliness. You're struggling with the debility, not able to be able to do what you, you can't, you can't do the things that you always wanted to do. You don't have that strength anymore. And it's within this context, he was able to show so much gevura within this context. Not being able to sit at a table, the head of a table, not having your wife. But he made it his business, not his business, he was in such control. There was no shochan, there was no self-pity, there was no feeling bad for himself. He was able to struggle through all of this. I mean, I can still picture and how many older people and being absorbed in their own futility, feeling sorry for themselves, wouldn't be able to do things he did, how he jumped to go to every simcha. I can still picture him being handed a newborn, a young little baby, and whether a great-grandchild. The smile on his face was ear to ear. And it wasn't fake. It wasn't a fake smile. The dancing, you couldn't dance at 104. But it's a gemach tanzen, dancing on both sides at a dear grandson's wedding. He really wanted to be there. And when we think about a legacy, either in yeshiva or the mishpacha, the legacy we should have is stop making excuses. Don't allow yourself to pity yourself. This man was with gevura. Mamish, tremendous gevura. You've heard before, he stood by Laman. You don't have to stand by Laman. He never looked for excuses. You think he was able to really stand easily, and when he had the landing, his hearing wasn't so good, so he stood right by the beam to hear the landing. He had a job here. He came. He fulfilled what he needed to do. Despite all odds, despite all shverikan, he was able to do this. And in terms of myself, and I hope for everyone here, I would say that we should try to take that inspiration, and instead of allowing ourselves to be blinded by the shaykhan of, I can't do it, it's too hard, it's too hot, it's too this, it's too whatever. We should take it upon ourselves in his chus to forge on the way he forged on, to work, no matter how difficult the circumstances, and do what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to do, to serve him in the greatest possible way with all of our kindness. He's our Rabbi.
We're going to conclude with the Kel Male, Yeshiva, and Mordechai Lilly.
Gershon, ben Reb David, שהלך לעולמו, ואהבו ייתן צדקה והזכרת נשמתו בגן עדן תהי מנוחתו לכן בעל רחמים יסתירהו בסתר כנפיו לעולמים ויצרור החיים את נשמתו אדוני הוא נחלתו וינוח בשלום על משכבו ונאמר אמן.
There are still some Mishnayos left in the Radin Yeshiva, or Mishnayos as they Shmoso. Anyone's interested in still signing up, please see the shiur over here. We're going to daven Narav in 1 minute.